What I want to do now is tell you a little bit about the speakers this evening. We've got two speakers, and they both have been doing projects with the Faraday Institute on artificial intelligence and what that means to be humans, or how that affects humans, particularly humans made in the image of God. And they'll be talking about this topic of could robots replace humans made in the image of God. The two speakers are, first of all, Professor Peter Robinson, who's from Cambridge University. He's Professor of Computer Technology here. And his speciality is human-computer interaction, and that's his head there, which does a bit of human interaction. I expect he'll be telling us about this, won't he? The other speaker who will follow him is Professor John Wyatt from University College London, who's professor, well, he tells me he's emeritus professor, but he's a professor of ethics and perinatology there. In earlier years, he dealt particularly with very early births, premature births, and keeping very young children alive from that. He's broadened out to be more interested in biomedical ethics and the wider implications of technological advances, so he is also leading our work on AI and what it means to be human. So that's quite enough for me. I'll hand over to those two. I think Peter's going first, aren't you? And then we'll have John after him, and then plenty of time for questions, so do save them up at the end. Over to you, Pete.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Bob. And thank you all for coming. The talk, as you all have gathered, falls into two parts. I'm going to do the geeky bit, and then John's going to tell you the difficult stuff that will make you think and ask questions later. So I'm a computer technologist, and computer technologists aren't noted for their interest in things like ethics, and I want to explain perhaps why it is of some interest to consider these things, and indeed why I've come to be interested in robots and what robots do. Now, of course, robots are a lot in the news at the moment. You perhaps saw see, even a computer technologist can't make technology work. There we go. Well, we'll better. You may have been watching the news last week, and there were the films of the latest robotic dog, Spot, from Boston Dynamics. One of the problems that robots has is getting through doors, but this dog just calls for its friend, who is better equipped to get through doors, and can actually open doors, and indeed, slowly. And this is an interesting video, partly because the technology that they've managed to achieve is really quite extraordinarily good, and they're very polite dogs. They wait for each other to go through. But the flurry of press comments about these dogs, now they can open doors, will take over the world, which is unlikely to be the case, really. And this is just generally a problem that they can't unlock the door yet, so it'll be a little while yet. It's taken them 8 years to get a dog that could open a door, so I'm not too worried about the dogs taking over just yet. But a lot of people who are quite intelligent are worried about the increasing use of artificial intelligence techniques, things that manage large volumes of information, and a lot of it focuses on robots, and when people think of robots, they think of things that look a bit like humans. And that's actually an interesting question of why do people do that? That tells us something, I think, about people rather than about technology. And let's go back a little bit to the technology that underpins this. What's different between people and machines? And I'd say that one of the things about people is that we are interested in relationships, particularly with other people. And that's something that I've been studying. Because I'm interested in the way that people talk to computers, one of the ways that we can understand that better is by seeing how people talk to each other. And the way that people talk to each other isn't just through words, but it's through things like facial expressions. So actually, while I'm talking to you, at you, I'm also looking at your faces, and I can see if you're interested or bored or confused or whatever, and understanding. And if you're lucky, I modify what I'm doing accordingly. So your faces are actually signaling something to me that I need to understand. And typically when a computer's interacting with you, it doesn't pay much attention. So I've been interested for a few years in these sort of social signals that people use as part of their communication. And actually this goes back a long way to a great Cambridge scientist, Charles Babbage, who 130 odd years ago, shortly after he published his book on the origin of species, published a book on the expression of emotions in man and animals. And an interesting book. It studied the facial expressions that people use to convey different emotional sense in what they're doing. An interesting book, because it was one of the first scientific books to use photographs as part of the evidence, and some of the photographs, one of the plates is shown here. The pictures down the right-hand side are taken from a collection by a French scientist, Guillaume Duchesne de Boulogne, who had been taking photographs, particularly of this tramp that you see here, from the who he had found on the streets of Paris, and he invited this chap in, and you see a sort of neutral pose at the top, and then when he'd been told a joke, and he's smiling, and then in the bottom picture they've actually attached electrodes to his face to activate the same muscles to see that if he experiences happiness. He didn't. But it's an interesting question, which comes first, the expression of the happiness or the muscle movement? Well, from his work, Darwin thought that these expressions were universal, and it actually gave humans an evolutionary advantage. And he did experiments to test this, and the experiments that he did involved taking the photographs that Duchesne had put together. Darwin had a set of these photographs. Actually, Darwin's collection of them is in the University Library here in Cambridge. If you ask nicely, you can go and see them. They're big photographs of people expressing different emotions. And Darwin did experiments to see if people perceived the same emotions in these. And he did this by what we'd now call crowdsourcing. He invited people round for dinner, and over drinks before dinner, passed around the photographs and asked them what they saw, and put the answers into a spreadsheet. The spreadsheets are also in the University Library. You see them on the right here, left here. And you've got names down one side, Lord so-and-so, Lady so-and-so, and the numbers of the pictures across the top and the emotions that they perceived. Well, and he saw that there was a consensus view. Well, a couple of years ago, one of my postdocs, Marwa, who's somewhere in the audience here, repeated this experiment using modern crowdsourcing techniques. So she digitized the photographs, put them online, and we got something like 20,000 people online to look at them and classify what they perceived in the photographs. And so actually under these photographs that we used for the trial, you see the original Darwin labels and the more recent labels that we collected by crowdsourcing. And they're remarkably similar. The language is a bit different, but essentially people still perceive the same emotions in the photographs, and there is a universal language. It hasn't changed much in 130 years. Well, we sort of know that. Facial expressions are important. Those of you who are keen on children's films will have seen Disney's film Inside Out, where a young girl's emotions are expressed by these actors, sort of characters working inside her head, showing variously anger, disgust, joy, fear, and sadness. And actually these are five quite important emotions. They're very much the emotions that Darwin was studying in his work. There's one that's actually missing from here that Darwin studied, which is surprise. I suppose that just says there are no surprises in Disney films. But obviously these are something quite important. They're something that actors use. So actually there's something here about people that we understand these, we see these in other people, not in ourselves, and it's an important part of our communication. And that perhaps gives us our first fixed point that tells us that there's something different about the way that people react to each other. And it is that we have relationships. We have relationships with each other. We care about what other people are feeling and thinking. We see it in their faces and understand it. And of course, from a Christian perspective, we'd also say we have a relationship with God. And there's something about those relationships that makes people special, and it's something that does distinguish us from the machines that we're going to be talking about, and John will return to that later. But I'll say a bit more about facial expressions first. Just as Disney use them now, actually these expressions of emotions have been understood by actors for a long time. Back in the early 20th century, in 1909, this woman, Florence Lawrence, was a major starlet in Hollywood. And she was more productive than modern Hollywood stars. She was producing 3 feature films a week. 3 a week, level of productivity you don't see nowadays. Of course, the advantage was that the films were only 20 minutes long, because that was as long as a roll of film would go, and she didn't have to learn her lines because they were silent films. But the fact that they were silent meant that she had to express things through her face, and this advertising card for her shows you the range of emotions that she could express in her face. There's an interesting subtlety that the one top left is called piety, and the one bottom right is called sadness. And I think they're indistinguishable. So that maybe says something about the morals of Hollywood starlets even in 1909. But the fact is that understanding facial expressions is an important part of human communication. So we actually tried to see if we could build a computer system that could analyze these. And we put something together, about 15 years ago now, where we pointed a camera at someone's face, tracked features on the face, understood from that gestures they were making with their face, things like smiling, nodding, and then from those we can infer their mental state. In this case, the woman being filmed was being asked to act as if she was agreeing, and you see there's a lot of smiling and nodding of the head, and in fact the red trace that you see below is agreeing. And that was quite an interesting system. We could distinguish a number of different mental states that might be useful for people who were working with computers to see if they were confused or interested or uncertain about what was going on. And in fact, the student who put this system together has made quite a successful company out of it called Affectiva, now in America. This picture shows you the work they're doing, which is particularly understanding how much pleasure people are experiencing, which you can tell from facial expressions quite well. And her company uses this for things like looking at draft copies of advertisements that are going to be shown on television, showing them to an audience, and then automatically monitoring the audience faces and seeing which bits they enjoy and making sure that that is what the company wants. It also turns out to be quite useful for political monitoring. If you watch people while they're watching a political debate, and she's done work during the American presidential debates, and you can see a change in people's political views between the beginning and the end of the debate is correlated with which bits of the debate they were smiling at. So actually you can use this quite effectively to predict how people will respond to things on television. Well, we've done other work here since. In fact, this pleasure upset axis is something called valence, and we have another tool that monitors the face now, and we sort of have a spot moving around at the top right here, where the valence scale is going from sad to happy, and then there's a vertical axis called arousal going from passive at the bottom to active at the top. This is another way of describing emotions rather than using lots of words. We sort of plot them in this space. And we've used that in a tool that we were putting together as part of a European project where we were trying to teach children with autism spectrum conditions about emotions. And the way that this worked was we had lots of games that they could play where they had to try and understand the emotions of characters, and also some where they had to look at a video and reenact the emotions that they saw. And we then used this to tell them whether they were doing it well. And the tool that did this looked a bit like this. So the top left, there's a video that's being shown. Then you see somebody who's actually trying to replicate it, and then we give them a diagnosis of which parts of their facial expression were actually failing to track the video. And this actually turned out to be quite a useful therapy for people with autism spectrum conditions to try and help them improve their understanding of emotions. Well, when Darwin wrote his book, he wasn't just interested in humans, he was interested in other species. He looked at dogs and cats and horses, and these pen sketches from his book on the emotions show a dog being angry, and a cat being aroused, and at the bottom being affectionate. And it turns out you can do very similar analyses of other animals. So we've tried our hand at this, and actually the particular animals that we've been looking at, actually is work by Marwa Mahmood, who did the Darwin experiment, is looking at sheep. It turns out that sheep have very expressive faces. So these are some pictures from some work that Marwa's been doing, where you can take a picture of a bunch of sheep. You must talk to her afterwards and discover how you get a flock of sheep to look at the camera when you're taking the picture. It's harder than you might think. And indeed, if you look at this, some of them, even on here, you get occasional sheep who will moon at the camera. But apart from that, it's... And what it's then doing is picking out all the sheep faces here and running an analysis. And it turns out sheep have expressive faces. Their ears are quite expressive, and their mouths, their noses. And you can analyze these and make inferences about which ones are happy sheep and which ones have difficulties. And in this picture, you can't quite see it on this, but there's one that's ringed in red as being in mild pain. It's the picture that's blown up at the bottom. And indeed, that was the one sheep in the flock that was having difficulties. Well, that's just an aside. It's a trailer. If you want to hear more about this, watch Country File on Sunday when Mar will be talking about this work. These sheep are actually sheep belong to someone called Adam Henson, who you may know presents that program. Well, that's about facial analysis. What about robots and robots that express faces? Well, we were interested to see whether when people communicate with a machine, it helps if the machine looks like a person and has an expressive face like a person. So we had this robot made. He's called Charles. That's because he looks like Charles Babbage, the father of computing, and another Cambridge scientist. Actually, we wanted a fairly old face, so it had wrinkles in it, because wrinkles are good for showing movement of the muscles. And this head has inside it a couple of dozen motors that replicate the key muscles in the face. And you can activate these and make it pull different facial expressions. You see some of them here, and you'll be able to play with it afterwards. And we have a little program running here where you point a camera at a person and it just mirrors whatever you're doing. And we were interested in doing experiments with this to see how it might improve people's communication. The particular scenario that you see here was the suggestion that it might make a better navigator to help you in a car rather than a standard satellite navigation system. So if you actually had a robot sitting next to you in the car giving you directions, would this be a good idea? The answer is almost certainly no, and a waste of a seat. But the video did get an awful lot of publicity when this was put out by the university for its 800th anniversary. And lots of people got very excited about having robot navigators in their cars, which wasn't quite the point. It was actually a joke, but it was somewhat lost on the press. And indeed, if and when you see this robot working, you'll discover that actually the movements of its face are peculiarly curious. You will find it somewhat unsettling to interact with it, because people are very good at reading other people's faces, and we can see if there's some anomaly in the way the face is acting, and there are a lot of anomalies. We really haven't, I mean, despite very clever programming by people like Ian who'll demonstrate it, it simply does not look like a human. The movement is slightly unnatural, very unnatural on a bad day, and you find that upsetting. You just find it creepy to talk to. So actually, it turned out that this robot wasn't much use for science, because we were interested to see how realistic it had to be for people to engage with it empathically. And we found that it was just impossible to engage with it empathically, because you couldn't take it seriously, because it sort of had these spasms in its movement. However, it turned out there was one use that we put to that was actually scientifically of some value. We discovered that as part of the work of training medical students to be doctors, they have difficulty sometimes when they encounter patients with particular diseases. And one in particular is called dystonia, which is where you have uncontrollable muscle spasms in the face. And now the one thing our robot's really good at is uncontrollable muscle spasms. So we got this very brave man who has dystonia came in and allowed us to film him while he was having a conversation. And of course, he displayed these various spasms. And we could then replay those on the robot. And so we could then make introduce medical students to the robot, and they could have a conversation with the robot before they met real patients with dystonia. And we found that if we did this preparation, it desensitized the medical students. And so when they actually met real patients for the first time, they didn't show the sort of disgust that most people would do when they saw this strange facial movement. So in that sense, it was useful. Unfortunately, it also turned out if we simply showed the medical students videos of patients with dystonia, that was just as effective. So the robot, we haven't really found a good scientific use for. It is, however, extremely good for publicity. And if you tell people you've got a robot, you find that you will get invited onto things like chat shows on Spanish television. This is a program called El Hormiguero, which is the sort of equivalent of the Graham Norton show. It goes out 4 nights a week in prime time, and every night it has a 10-minute science slot, which is rather better than Graham Norton manages. And you may see there's some sort of rather strange ant in the background. I really won't explain why that's part of the set. And they were terrifically excited by watching this robot replicating things. Now, I have to say, when we were invited on this, I talked with some of my postdocs, and one said, so you're going to take an experimental face tracker and an unreliable robot and show them on live television. What could possibly go wrong? Well, I said, it's Spanish television, no one's going to know. Now, in fact, it worked perfectly. And what interestingly, the presenter rehearsed for 3-5 minutes in the afternoon, something like that. And in that space of time, he worked out what would look good on television and what wouldn't. And so when he actually started demonstrating it in the program, it looked brilliant. And I was very grateful to him, because it's terribly easy to make this robot not look very good at all. Well, anyway, this sort of makes people think that I'm an expert on robots, which I'm not really, but I'm quite interested in people. And it's interesting, when I talk about robots, people get very worried about robots, sentient robots taking over the world. And this has made me ponder why this might be the case. What is it about robots that when we picture robots, we think of ones that look like humans and are malicious? And I think that says something about people more than it says about robots. Well, if we go back in fiction, of course, this has always been the case. The early stories of robots, Karel Čapek's Rossum's Universal Robots, and a play written in 1920, features robots. It's actually the first play to use the word robot. And the robots there are actually made of human flesh, in fact, but they do become independent of their human masters and take over the world, and it ends badly. And that's sort of been the theme through most fiction to do with robots ever since. The robots look like people, so we see here Metropolis in the middle, 1927, the Fritz Lang film, with a robot being used by the evil inventor to impersonate somebody, and through to Asimov's I, Robot, where the robots become sentient and independent. And so the interesting question is, what is it about us that makes us assume that robots will look like us and be aggressive? I think the only writer not to follow this line is probably Douglas Adams, who of course famously described robots as, in his book The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, as your plastic pal who's fun to be with. And but that's a relatively uncommon view. And that does tell us something about people. It tells us that there's something broken about our relationships with each other, that we assume that other people are going to be malicious, because that's what we think of people generally, and that says something about the breakdown of relationships. And of course, it's a breakdown of our relationship with God, that we don't understand the relationship with God that makes us special and different from machines. And that's an interesting comment on people, and I hope that John will pick this up later. I'll just say a little bit more about robots, because there are robots that do worry me, but they aren't ones that look like people. The robots that worry me are the real robots we have around us. Well, some robots are fine, doing boring, repetitive, and dangerous jobs like making cars, or very delicate jobs like making integrated circuits, or indeed assisting with surgery. Those are good uses of robots, but they're hardly going to become sentient. They're not going to suddenly start making a different brand of car. But there are robots that we perhaps don't perceive of even as robots. And these are the things that are hidden in the infrastructure of the world around us. They're things like the global telecommunications system. You know, you're all probably carrying mobile phones with you. If they all got together, their collective intelligence is quite substantial. Now, I don't think they're going to turn on you, but it's an interesting thought. There's a lot of something that we rely on there that is a large computational system. It takes inputs, it has effects. To any world, that's a robot. There are satellite navigation systems, again, and the one that perhaps interests me most is automatic trading systems in the city. These are robots. They really do monitor the real world. They have an effect on the real world. Arguably, they contributed to the 2008 financial crisis. And yet they don't look like people, but they're not actually malicious. That's not really the problem here. What we have here is incompetence, probably. What really does worry me, and I spend a lot of my life teaching students computer science, is there's a lot of incompetent computer scientists out there. Not the ones I taught, obviously, but the other ones. And it's very easy for them to do things that actually just make mistakes. And the computers give the opportunity for those mistakes to be replicated and to have very fast effects over a very large scale. But there is nevertheless this interest in robots, and if it's not ones that look like people, it's sort of, well, automatic vacuum cleaners we perhaps don't think of much as robots. But nevertheless, these humanoid ones are important. Particularly, it seems the Japanese have a fascination with humanoid robots coming in and acting as waiters, or bottom right here, conducting wedding services. And that's something vaguely odd about that people want a robot to do this. It's just somehow the name triggers something in them. And there's a whole world of, as with most technologies, less savory sides of it, and sex robots are a growth industry, I have to tell you, although one I know very little about. But this idea of robots is not new. Interestingly, if we go back, there was this mechanical monk was made in the 16th century, and it has many clockwork parts. It stands about 20 inches high and moves around and then stops every so often to beat its chest and to work through its rosary. So it's sort of a mechanical monk that says your prayers for you. Of course, those of you who are, again, keen Douglas Adams readers will remember that he, in one of his books, had an electric monk that would believe things for you that were too difficult for you to believe, which is sort of the modern take on this. So we've had robots for a long time, and we're sort of giving them some sort of human characteristics, even pretending that the robot can somehow replace your relationship with God by saying your prayers for you. And that perhaps does say something about why are we putting these machines in our image and replacing our place? We have this fascination with robots, which I think just says something about us, even though they're not really made in our image. It's a poor physical representation. There's no relationship there. I'm interested in ones that recognize emotions and display them, but that's not the same as actually having empathy. And of course, they have no spiritual side to them. But at this point, I think I shall hand over to John Wyatt. That's enough technology, and John's going to now continue our thinking about God, AI, and humans by thinking about some of the theological and ethical issues that arise in these relationships. There you are, John.
Thanks very much, Peter. Well, as you've heard, my background is not as a technologist or computer scientist, but actually as a baby doctor. And you may say, well, what on earth am I doing dabbling in this field, at which I'm clearly a rank amateur, and I would accept that I clearly am. But my interest is really coming out of the history of working as a practicing clinician in a very technologically demanding and interesting field, is thinking how technology changes our understanding of what it means to be human. And in many different ways, as technology advances, it has impacts on us as human beings. And as Peter has said, one of the fascinating things is how we respond to these machines. And what are the implications for the future? This is a little Nio robot, about 18 inches high, talks, moves around. And it's interesting that looking at the expressions on people's faces, that this is something that's seen as fun, as good to engage with. And manufacturers are working out how best to get us to engage with these devices which are becoming available. Many seem small and cute and childlike. Some are more specifically human-like. This is Hanson Robotics. I was interested that Hanson Robotics had made this face. This is Sophia, made by Hanson Robotics, who's been had some news coverage recently because has been at a number of public gatherings. It's interesting if you go on to Hanson Robotics' website, and they talk about uncanny realism, friendly and empathic AI, and then look at this, realizing the dream of friendly machines that love and care about humans. So immediately there is all this person language, loving, caring. Here's another example, Jibo, using very sophisticated, effective technology. He looks, listens, and learns. He loves to be around people, and the relationships he forms are the single most important thing to him. So it's quite interesting to look at this language, these are commercial companies, and they're trying to get us to engage, and the way they're doing it is using this kind of very emotionally laden language. And I think what lies behind this is this human phenomenon we have of anthropomorphism. Anthropos, human, morphe, form. To see a human form in a non-human being. And I think if we think about the human on the one side and the machine on the other, we can see two-way psychological movement. On the one hand, we tend to put our humanity onto the machine. We see the machine as being, in some sense, a human form. That's anthropomorphism. And then there's a movement the other way. We increasingly understand ourselves as being machines. So we understand the working of the human brain by looking at machines, especially computing machines. And maybe it's true that modern people increasingly understand themselves as, in some sense, sophisticated biological machines. And at the same time, we understand what it means to be an intelligent machine by looking at our own humanity. We impose our humanity onto the machine. And I suspect, as we look towards the future, we're going to, certainly judging by the amount of investment that's going on into this kind of area, that if these commercial investments are successful, our environment is increasingly going to be invaded by beings that are intended to simulate some aspect of personhood. I think some of them are going to be physically incarnate. They're going to occupy space, like this head. They're going to move around and be part of our physical space. Some of them are going to be avatars on a screen. This is Ellie, a virtual therapist. And you can see the camera above the screen, and the software is able to engage in real time with the human person, and then and monitor the emotional content of the human response, and then respond in real time like a therapist. My wife, who's a professional counselor, saw the video of this. You can go onto YouTube and see at least a simulated counseling session. And she said this is so clever and so sophisticated. They're using exactly this kind of counseling techniques that a professional counselor would do, nodding and saying, and what makes you think that? And waiting, and yeah, you seem rather disturbed by that question, and so on. So quite sophisticated technology, and you could see as this kind of technology advances, the argument will come, well, why do we need a human therapist? Why not? This is going to be available 24/7. It's not going to get tired. It doesn't get bored. It doesn't take up unethical practices, and it's constantly learning in its engagement. And it's going to be more efficient. It's going to be more effective, and so on. You can see the attractions of this kind of technology. Bizarrely, you can also upload all your information, all your tweets, all your emails, and so on. And then after you've died, you will live forever in a digital form. You will continue to send tweets and emails and to your loved ones. And so, again, some kind of avatar will continue to represent you in the future. This is a commercial website, Turnimeed. And some simulated persons are just are simply a voice. They don't have any physical appearance, but we already are meeting Google Home and Alexa. I'm sure many people here will have conversations with Alexa. I understand from Amazon that Amazon have no less than 5,000 professionals, IT professionals, currently working on Alexa in order to make it more sophisticated, better in its response, more human-like, more responsive, and so on. With, again, the goal being that we will establish a relationship with this device, a relationship in quotes. So anthropomorphism is a universal human tendency. It's largely outside conscious control. I was at a conference just last year where we were with a group of very senior church leaders, male and female, and the conference was talking about technology and the implications and some of the theological implications. And as part of the conference, we visited a computer lab. And on the computer lab, there were 5 of these little Nio robots. They were all switched on. Their arms were moving. Their lights were, LED eyes were blinking, and they were talking. And as this group of senior church leaders walked into the room, immediately the atmosphere changes. And a diocesan bishop, no less, gets down on his hands and knees and says, "Oh, look at the little darling. Hello, how are you?" And people are waving and smiling and so on. And I'm watching this, absolutely astounded. But it also made me realize, as I reflected about this, that many of these people would be parents. They would have cared for small toddlers. And we know as an adult and as a parent that if you come across a small toddler just wandering around, you engage with them. You don't just ignore them. You say, "Hello, how are you? And are you lost? And what are you doing? And do you feel all right?" And the manufacturers were sort of trading on this instinctive parental behavior in order to get us to engage with these little devices. We've already, as Peter said, there is a huge investment or a significant investment going on into this area, and people are claiming that the new sex robots that will become available that are activated by this kind of emotionally valuable intelligence, effective intelligence will be able to engage with us in all kinds of ways. And of course, this is leading to really significant and very difficult ethical questions. For instance, should someone who has a paedophile, sexual attraction to children, should they be allowed to have a child robot that in some way emulates a child? Or, the arguments will be, well, it's better that they have a robot than they do something terrible to a real child. Is that something appropriate? How do we think about use of this kind of technology? Perhaps you're not surprised that there's already a campaign against sex robots, particularly coming from a feminist perspective, seeing this as particularly objectifying women and adding to the abuse of women in society, and that sex robots should be regulated or banned. One of the interesting and troubling things is that if you have a human-like robot and you do something really unpleasant to them in front of a human being, you can show that the same kind of emotional response, which is including the activation of certain brain regions in a human observer, is similar to what would happen if you were actually torturing a real human being. And I think this is going to raise all sorts of questions about the regulation of these devices, and it makes me wonder whether there might have to be regulations if we live in a society where there are many of these humanoid robots around us, whether there would have to be some kind of laws about what you were allowed to do with them. And at first glance, that might sound bizarre. It's only a machine. But then I think about the fact that we live in a society that has very strict rules about what we can do, for instance, with kittens, about the abuse of a young animal, and quite strict laws. You can be sent to prison for abusing an animal such as a kitten. Is that because we feel that the rights and interests of kittens are so important that we have to have criminal laws to protect them? Or is it more saying something about our society, that if people are allowed to torture kittens without any kind of redress, then that's saying something about us? It's saying something about the kind of society we want to belong to. And if that's true, therefore, for kittens, maybe it could be true for lovable humanoid robots, that particularly a robot that's saying, please don't hurt me, you're hurting me, please, you're torturing me, don't do that, ow, ow, you're hurting me. Should you be allowed to abuse a robot that's responding in that way? So you can see some of these very complex and challenging and difficult questions. This is a quote from a journalist. He said, human compassion can be gamed. It's the ultimate psychological hack, a glitch in human response that can be exploited in an attempt to make a sticky product. That's why designers give AIs human characteristics in the first place. They want us to like them. So it's a commercial aim, motivated primarily by maximizing shareholder value, to make us engage, to engage our natural, compassionate responses with these devices. There's a related issue here, and that is, how do we think about developing a relationship with a machine that's simulating an animal? One of these is a real flesh and blood animal, and one of them is a very sophisticated machine. The one on the left is a real dog, and the one on the right is a robot called Paro, which is designed to simulate the activity of a small baby seal. It responds to its owner's voice, it learns and mimics, and it's been shown that if you give a Paro to elderly people in a care home, particularly those who are depressed or lonely, that it leads to an improvement in mood and has positive outcomes. And is that a matter of concern? Does it make any difference whether you have something that's a genuine flesh and blood being versus something that is entirely simulated? If the outcomes are positive, does it matter? If, for instance, an elderly person is feeling lonely and depressed, does it matter if they suddenly have a friend and this friend makes them feel so much better and there's someone to talk to and their mood improves? Does it matter if their so-called friend is actually, again, just a clever piece of machinery that's leading to simulate the activity of a human person? And is there going to become a point at which we should think about giving rights to intelligent machines? Actually, this is not just science fiction. There are already philosophers. This is a young philosopher, David Gunkel, who's written a book called The Machine Question, where he argues that intelligent machines should be given the benefit of doubt. They should be treated. If they seem to be acting in a moral way, then we should regard them as being part of the moral community. We should protect their interests, and we should. This is an inevitable part of a liberal society, of recognizing machine rights. So how do we think about some of these very complex and challenging questions? I come back as a Christian to think about the fundamental nature of reality, and what Orthodox Christian theology says is that reality is more than just matter and energy. There's another foundational category of reality, and that's, I think, the best way of thinking of it, not in terms of consciousness or mind or something else, but it's actually in terms of personhood. That's persons. And this way of thinking starts really in the New Testament, but it was particularly formulated by the Cappadocian Church Fathers in the 4th century AD. And in the Greek, it was to summarize that God's being is hypostasis in ecstasis, which is hypostasis, being, persons in ecstasis. It means literally to stand outside oneself. So the Church Fathers thought of the Holy Trinity, of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, that each of those three were persons. The Father was a person, the Son was a person, the Spirit was a person, and that their very being was constituted as they in a movement to one another. So the Father could only be Father because of the existence of the Son. As the Father loved the Son, his fatherhood, his personhood was constituted. So in this way of thinking, personhood is a category of reality which is ontologically foundational, to use a philosophical term. It is something which you cannot define at a more basic level. To be a person is as basic as one can get. And persons are not reducible to matter and energy. They're not limited to matter and energy. Persons are constituted by their relations. Their being is derived from the movement of communion, from the freedom to give oneself to the other. So the concept of self-giving love is at the very heart of what it means to be a person. And in this way of thinking, to be a person is to participate in some sense in the divine life of the triune God. Because we are made in God's image, we image God's personhood. We are persons as well, because we are made in God's image, in that Christian way of thinking. So, cogito ergo sum, said Descartes. The most fundamental thing is, I think, therefore I am. But a Trinitarian way puts that on its head and says, you love me, therefore I am. That my being is constituted in my relations. And related to that is this idea of, which was popularized particularly by Martin Buber, a Jewish existentialist philosopher, and then taken up by Karl Barth as well, the distinction between an I-you relationship between persons and an I-it relationship between immaterial beings that were not persons. And what Buber and others argued is that there is something utterly profound and ineffable about the I-you relationship, which is unique to the relationship. There is something that is almost impossible to describe about the relationship we have with others. The deep meeting with another person is fundamentally different from the I-it relationship, where we engage with things that are not persons. And this has obvious implications if we then come back to the robots, because the intelligent machines, however sophisticated they are, and however much they behave in a way which simulates personhood, actually they remain an it. They can never be a genuine person in this way of thinking. The I-you is something that is unique. That engagement is something that's unique to human persons. A related concept is the idea of being born as opposed to being made. And again, this goes back to the early church fathers, who in the Nicene Creed, which goes AD 325, the Creed says, we believe in one Lord, Jesus Christ, the only Son of God, eternally born of the Father, God from God, light from light, true God from true God, born, not made, or in the Old English, begotten, not made. And the early church fathers were trying to, again, to understand the relationship between God the Father and God the Son. And they said, was the Son part of the creation? No, the Son was different because the Son was born, begotten, not made. And behind that distinction, again, is something that I think is very profound. That which we give birth to is fundamentally the same as us. Our children come as a gift from our being, and they're equal in status and dignity to ourselves. We care for, nurture, and educate our children, but we cannot control them, and we cannot determine what their nature is, because their nature is given. They are the same as us. But that which we make, or create, or construct, is fundamentally different from us. It's a product of our will as opposed to our being. and is therefore ours to mold and control, and we can determine what it is for and what it will do. So that distinction, again, I think is a helpful way in to think that in the end, however clever that technology is, it isn't born, it's made. And therefore, its nature, its fundamental nature is different from us, from those, the beings, the human persons who are born and whose nature is given to them as they are born. So I think that as we go into this interesting and challenging future, this distinction between the I-it relationship and the I-you relationship is going to be, I think, very important for us to maintain. I think the challenge will be that increasingly we're going to find beings that are actually its, but they seem to be a you. They behave as though they are a you. They take on the role of a you. And then, so there's going to be a blurring. The danger is that there's a blurring between these two categories. So just to summarize, I would argue that intelligent machines will increasingly play a role in our society, whether we like it or not, and they will play a role as, in some sense, simulated or analogous persons in interactions with humans. But they cannot share our human nature. They cannot participate in genuine I-you relations. Orthodox Christian theology highlights a profound distinction between beings who are born and those who are made. This distinction may be increasingly important as we're surrounded by machines that simulate human behavior, relationality, and personhood. And I think for debate, and it's something that I genuinely don't know the answer to what extent should we welcome the introduction of simulated companions for elderly people, people with dementia, children, those with psychiatric disorders, and so on? One of the interesting things when you think about care of the elderly people is that you can divide the caring tasks into two. On the one hand, there are physical caring tasks, things like feeding, washing, changing beds, all that back-breaking stuff that's involved in caring for somebody who's dependent. And then there are companionship tasks of actually being, of having a human relationship, of being friendship, of combating loneliness and so on. Now, the argument could be that why don't we say that the machines should concentrate on doing the first tasks, in other words, the back-breaking physical stuff, and that will release human beings to be able to do the really important human stuff, which is combating loneliness. And I think that's a nice theory. I'm afraid to say that the reality seems to be exactly the opposite, that there's a lot of work on robotics and care for the elderly, and most of it is about producing simulated companions rather than doing all the changing the beds and so on. And I think the reason for that is it turns out to be much easier to make a simulated companion than it is to make a machine that actually manages to change a bed and feed people and wash them and all the rest. And that's therefore where the profits are going to be. And so I think there are some real questions about how this technology is going to be used and how we as a general public feel that it ought to be regulated. Are we happy that it's really largely being done by the profit motive, by the chance to make maximize shareholder value, or do we feel that this technology is so powerful that it ought to be regulated and democratically controlled in a way that we as a population say we want to say how it is being used? And so I think, how can this technology be regulated in order that it's employed to protect and enhance human flourishing rather than threaten it? And finally, should the deliberate maltreatment and torture of human-like robots be made illegal? So I don't have questions for all these, but I think this is something we need to discuss. Thank you very much.
Well, we have plenty of time for questions. So there is a microphone. Please speak into that. And both will answer, or either will answer. So who wants to go first? Over here.
Hi, thank you so much for both talks. They were incredibly stimulating. I guess this is a question to both of you. You've talked about technology and artificial intelligence as being external to what we recognize as the human person, but more and more there are discussions and interventions that seem to be combining technologies and human capabilities in the form of discussions about chips and the cerebral lace that you were talking about this morning, John. But what does that do in terms of our understanding of the human person as someone who's born versus artificial intelligence as being something that's made?
So I think the question particularly about the blur, where human beings are being meshed with the machines, where they're actually, the machines are becoming part of our bodies. Again, a very, I think, interesting and challenging question. I still want to maintain that distinction that that our human nature is something that's given to us, and that however much we merge with machines, that fundamental human nature cannot be destroyed or eradicated. But I think it raises very big questions about whether we want to go in that direction. And in particular, I think there's a big distinction between using this technology for restorative purposes, with the aim being to restore people back to normal human functioning. And I think using highly sophisticated and invasive technology to allow people to live a normal human life is entirely appropriate. But using the same technology to actually enhance human capabilities to a beyond normal human functioning is something I feel deeply queasy and uneasy about. And I think when we live in a world where there is so much pain, so much suffering, so much disability, so much disease, surely we should be focusing our sophisticated technology on restorative uses rather than trying to enhance our function beyond to a completely superhuman level. However, having said that, there are, again, many people, particularly in the sort of techno-optimist communities, Silicon Valley and so on, who have access to enormous amounts of money and who are very much in favor of some versions of transhumanism, trying to create better, new, better, more advanced versions of the human species. So I think this debate is going to run and run, and again, it's one where there has to be sort of democratic involvement. What is the best use of this technology?
That's a pretty thorough answer, go on.
No, thank you both very much. I think a key point of what you both said is that personhood is not just matter and energy. And I think a number of people, I just don't know, but I think a number of people might disagree with this because they would say as the human brain developed, then consciousness emerged when the complexity of the human brain became complex enough, and you might say personhood emerged. And so you could then argue, if that's correct, that when you make a robot's brain complex enough, that consciousness will emerge as an emergent property. So what's the answer you would give to that?
Thanks very much. No, I think you're absolutely right that these issues about personhood are highly contested. And what I was trying to present was a perspective from an Orthodox Christian position. But there are certainly a lot of people who would argue precisely as you have done, that personhood is basically an emergent phenomenon from the physical wiring of the brain, and that it simply requires a certain level of complexity, and that once you reach a certain level of complexity, then what we understand of as what is involved in human personhood is something that emerges. And it is quite true that if you accept that philosophy, sometimes called physicalism, that there is really nothing but matter and energy, and everything else is simply a product of matter and energy, then you have to accept that if it could come out of human wiring, then it could come out of machine wiring. There's no particular reason, why one particular kind of wiring might be better than another. And that is actually the roots of some of the dystopic fears about the future, because what people say is, well, okay, let's look what's come out of human wiring. Just look at some of the most evil characters of members of the Homo sapiens species, and also remember that some of the most evil and manipulative human beings don't come up with a little label saying, by the way, I'm evil. They may appear extremely friendly and positive, but they have very malign motives. So if that can happen once, why do we think that a super intelligent machine that has achieved the same kind of emergence might not also harbor evil but suppressed and concealed designs? Now, I personally think that's science fiction, but I can see the logic, how once you accept that physicalist narrative, then it does lead you inevitably to that conclusion that potentially very evil machines could be accidentally or purposefully generated. I think realistically, the danger is much more to do with evil human beings who use the technology for mad and bad things, rather than the machines themselves become evil. And I think we should be much more concerned about the abuse of this technology by human beings, rather than worrying too much about the emergence of some kind of evil superhuman.
I think that's exactly right. The emergence will take much longer to become a problem if it does happen. But the problems that we have with these machines are the ones that trouble all professionals, if you like. They're the question of motivation, which I think John has touched on. And there's no doubt that these machines could be used for maliciously or simply for the profit motive. And the way that a lot of this technology is being developed and deployed by half a dozen very big, very profitable companies is a cause for concern, because they are really interested in shareholder value. But there's also, my main concern is competence. I really worry about the fact that we've got these very complex systems that almost certainly have flaws in them, and the effects of those worry me much more than them becoming sentient and turning on us. And, I think it's more likely to be human error that's the problem.
Thank you both. I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about this claim. I think, John, you mentioned from philosophers that humanoid robots might be entitled to enter the moral community. And most moral communities, one quite foundational point of a moral community is that humans are not sold and bought commercially, or if they do, it becomes slavery. And most moral communities would at least claim that that is unethical. So if human robots become part of our moral community, they should not be bought or sold. And that implies they have a degree of freedom to choose who they go and where they go. Is that helpful at all in trying to identify what is the difference between a you and an it?
Thanks very much. I mean, I think you've illustrated some of the really problematic and confusing aspects of this debate. But there is a real problem here. And again, it's not a problem that is yet emerged, but it's coming. I'm virtually certain. And that is, of course, I don't know anything about the contents of your mind or consciousness. It's not possible for me to access actually what's going on in your mind at all. So therefore, we develop this ability, which the psychologists call theory of mind, where we impute to other human beings a vast array of complex things that are going on in their minds about their intentions and their desires and their freedom and everything else, just based on their behavior. And we do it instinctively without thinking about it. And exactly the same issue is going to arise with machines, in that there is no way of knowing actually what's going on. All we have is behavior. And if the behavior seems to be sentient, if it seems to be free, if the behavior is to make verbal claims of awareness and sentience and pain and so on, it's not going to be good enough to say, oh, well, it's a machine. I know it's a machine. You know, that kind of argument is not going to, I think, hold up. And so I think there is going to be genuine debate. Some people have said you're going to have juries who assess a particular software and try and come to a conclusion as to whether this has reached a threshold at which it should be granted some kind of rights. I mean, again, it all sounds bizarre, but I think philosophically there is a real problem here, that it's not possible for us to access the internal experience of any other being. And all we can do is go on its behavior.
So interestingly, one of the major efforts now in artificial intelligence, and as these systems get more complex, we really have no idea how they're coming to the conclusion that they're coming to when they offer advice of one sort or another. And that's a concern. And so one of the big problems, and a lot of academic effort is being devoted to trying to understand how you can explain what's going on inside a modern artificial intelligence system, which is hugely complex, doing a huge amount of computation. It's somehow been trained, it's learned from a large volume of data and is making inferences based on that. But it's not just a simple if this, then that, else something else program anymore. It's all probabilistic, it's very complex, depending on all sorts of factors. And trying to explain that is going to become important, especially when artificial intelligence systems replace juries, for example. It might be worthwhile actually having them give some sort of justification for the verdicts that they're coming to. Or if we have medical systems that are offering therapies, suggesting therapies, we'd quite like to know how they're coming to that conclusion. So this is a problem that's understood in artificial intelligence. The solution is not yet forthcoming.
Thank you very much. I'm wondering whether you're slightly limiting the extent to which you are really exploring this, because you speak in terms of matter and energy, and yet you are people of faith. And if you're people of faith, then you believe in spirit. Now, the thing is that within the Anglican faith, we have this three-legged stool of scripture, tradition, and reason. And reason is a really important part, although it doesn't actually play a very significant part of the church's thinking at the moment. I wish it did. It seems to be rather a short-legged stool. But the thing is, this whole thing about science and religion is actually unwrapping God's technology. Unwrapping God's technology. Why do you think that the spirit should be outside the reach of trying to understand what makes the spirit work? If we believe that we have life after death, you know, where does the memory reside? Does it reside in the brain, which turns into dust, or does it go into our spirit? And how does quantum mechanics work, which seems to break right across the limitations of the constants which govern gravity, light, and time? Those kind of issues seem to be really important, and therefore I feel we ought to be trying to understand how the spirit world works, as well as the matter and energy. And then you'll start to understand what we really are as machines which are both body and spirit. And it seems to me that we have to think about that a bit.
Gosh. Thanks very much. I mean, huge number of issues there, and that's why I use the expression personhood rather than spirit. I do believe that spirit exists, but this, of course, in the Christian tradition, the spirit is a person. The Holy Spirit is a person who is non-material and yet still is a person. So, I think there are limits to what science can achieve. I think, and you say, well, is that the case? I mean, I think it is, that science has a particular methodology, it has a particular way of tackling it, and there are some things that I believe will always be beyond the particular methodology that science uses. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't explore it. I'm all for using science as far as it goes, but I personally think that if you take these fundamental things like love, like beauty, like meaning, like purpose, these are categories which come outside of science. They're to do with the personal realm, and as science can understand love in terms of chemicals and in terms of, or maybe in terms of quantum physics, but it I don't believe penetrates the reality of what love is. That there are aspects of reality which I think will always remain outside the province that science is capable of reaching.
And I think there are things that God wants us to know about our relationship with Him, which perhaps the questions you're saying we should be investigating scientifically, but those are things that the Bible is devoted to telling us about. And the fact that it doesn't explore things like what heaven's like in any great detail, other than it's rather good, perhaps suggests that we don't need to know more about it at the moment. And that seems good enough for me, because we seem to have quite clear guidance there about the sorts of things that we need to know about our relationship with God. And that, therefore, I would suggest is something that we're unlikely to be able to determine more by our own efforts.
Thank you very much. Just a little context for my question. I'm a parish priest in South Oxfordshire and run a science mission project to have all these conversations, bringing people together. What is the impact of AI, in your view, the impact of AI on education and on jobs? Just to give you a particular example, one of the primary schools I look after has as their tagline basically preparing children for the future, including jobs that haven't even been invented yet. So I'm coming across quite a lot of concern and anxiety about how do we educate people for jobs, the impact of AI on the job market. A lot of worry and concern about that.
Well, wasn't it Keynes who first started asking the question how we're going to cope with the fact that we'll have so much leisure time we won't know how to occupy it? It doesn't seem to have entirely arrived yet. Now, I'm delighted that the school is preparing the next generation for a world where technology will play a more important role, and I hope it tells them something about understanding the ethics of technology, which is perhaps played down a lot. But I'm not sure that it's actually going to relieve them the need to do some sort of work in the future.
I think if you try to think of a profession which might be free from the risk of being in some sense affected or even replaced by AI, it's quite hard to think of professions which aren't at least going to be severely disrupted by the kind of intelligent machines that are coming.
Philosophers.
Philosophers. And I think preparing people for the future is genuinely difficult, therefore. I think the future will lie in giving people the range of skills to adjust. I think in this rapidly changing world, I mean, it is said that it's quite likely that people who are school children today may end up having several different careers in their lifetime and shifting into different areas as areas come and go and so on. I think also there are, from a church's point of view, I think there are huge pastoral issues, because I think it seems inevitable that there are going to be a lot of people who suffer from massive disruption of employment. And I think people are rather blasé sometimes, saying, oh, well, for all the millions of jobs that are lost, there are going to be millions of new jobs created. But actually, of course, they're not the same people. I think are we going to see a sort of massive job losses in things like retail and in drivers and in warehouse people and many manual jobs? Are we? And what's the idea that they're all going to go and do web design or AI servicing or so on seems quite unrealistic. So I think there are going to be very significant pastoral things of helping people who have massive disruptions in their particular work practices and so on.
We'll take one last question here, and then I think we'll stop for refreshments and so on, because I know some people have.
Hello, thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. I'm a mathematician, and a bit like the robots that everyone thinks will take over the world because they can open doors. My fear came from robots that can learn to beat humans at chess really, really rapidly, which has happened recently. But then on second thought, I thought, well, the robot beats the human being at chess, but does it enjoy doing it? And this goes down to this idea of personhood. What does move the human heart to do things? And this idea that we don't just do things because we have a need for them, like eating food, sleeping at night, but because we truly enjoy them. And the sense of pleasure that we have from these experiences. And I really can't see how machines can develop that, essentially, as a quality.
I think you're right. The machines won't experience pleasure. I think actually your comment about chess is very interesting because I'm a lapsed mathematician because I was no good at chess. But there are people who enjoy watching a chess match. Well, now the computers are better than people. Is it still enjoyable to watch? Go is a major spectator sport in much of the world. It's now the computers that are going to win, and yet people do enjoy watching the computer play. They see artistry and ingenuity in the way that it's playing. But we can see this progressing. It won't be that long before we have robotic footballers that are better than the physical ones. Are people going to enjoy watching those? I think that's rather different because there's a sort of tribal element to watching football. And I'm not sure that you would feel a tribal empathy with a group of robots running around a field. So I think there are interesting questions there, but it's not so much about whether the computers playing chess or Go or the robots running around the football pitch enjoy it, but whether they're actually sort of removing things from the human sphere that we enjoyed, and actually, once you've automated them, they cease to become a pleasure for spectators. This is an interesting challenge.
Great.
Okay, well, it remains for me to thank our two speakers again.
Thank you.